just following on from the circularity about diagnosis this morning, I'm going to talk about madness, or what some people will call psychosis, some people will call schizophrenia, or whatever, but we know what madness is, and I prefer the term madness. It's more understandable language. But a very early example story from my own training, because I always learn more from patients than my clinical training, it seemed to me. So something a patient taught me very early on was a 21-year-old woman when I was a 21-year-old man, and I was locked into the quiet room with her to keep her alive, because I was a nursing attendant at the time, completely untrained. And all I had to do was grab her if she went to smack her head into the wall, and I thought I could do that, but I didn't know what to do for the other, but, for the 2 hours that she didn't do that. And I think I was almost as nervous as she was. So I came up with, if you'd like to talk to me, that would be really nice, but it's okay if you don't. That's not bad in the clinical training. But unfortunately she didn't, understandably. Why would you talk to this complete stranger? So she didn't, but the next day she said, "My," and stopped. The following day she said, "Father," and stopped, and I thought, okay, we can do this one word at a time. But the next day she said nothing again, so I thought that's it. But the following day she said "me," so we now had "my," "father," "me." No idea what was going on, and the psychiatrist explained to me, I forgot to say, by the way, she hadn't spoken to anybody for 3 months before that, so I was feeling pretty, done something right, but I don't know what it means. But the reason she hadn't spoken to anybody for 3 months before that was because she had something called catatonic schizophrenia, which as a 21-year-old ignorant, naive person, I thought, that explains that. How do you know she has catatonic schizophrenia? Well, as various other people say, because she hasn't spoken for 3 months, and that's what people with this diagnosis do. Of course, later on, after established a bit more of a relationship and she felt a bit safer, she explained to me that the missing word was raped. And that was the first of many, many times when that sort of story or something similar emerged. So, but I'm going to bore you with some research because I think it's important to have some ammunition behind us when we try and explain to people who are still on the fence that even the most severe or seemingly extreme responses or symptoms or whatever you want to call them actually have a social basis to them. And just to remind ourselves that we are not as extreme as sometimes people might like to make us out to be. This is the United Nations last year talking about public policies continuing to neglect the preconditions of poor mental health, of the kind we're talking about today, such as violence, disempowerment, social exclusion, isolation, etc. The field of mental health continues to be over-medicalized, and the reductionist biomedical model, with support from psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry, dominates. So perhaps there is a paradigm shift coming. I've been waiting 40 years, some of you are as old as me, and still. But we're, like Lucy, we're not going to go away however long it takes. Sometimes you feel like you're getting a little bit closer when the United Nations gets it right. So we'll skip the advertising. That book isn't on sale anyway, but the Stroke Talking Introduction one in the same series as Lucy's is here. It's all this guy's fault. It's very important to have villains. I have lots of heroes, but an occasional villain is good. Emil Kraepelin invented this thing, schizophrenia. He actually used dementia precox, but then it became schizophrenia quite quickly. At the end of the 19th century, when real medical disciplines were actually coming up with real medical illnesses, and psychiatry was falling into disrepute. And so he decided to invent one, really, bottom line. And the key to inventing it was to make out that the people who had it, their difficulties could not be explained in terms of social circumstances. So this is a lovely photograph from Kraepelin's, I think this was a 9th edition of his textbook, by which time there were 150 pages of symptoms of this new illness. My favourite one of which was walking into cigar with a lighted cigar. Walking into church with a lighted cigar. That was about page 140, I can't remember. There's an endless list of symptoms of this invented illness, including at that point being gay, having no respect for superiors, falling in love with people regardless of how ugly they were, according to Kraepelin, presumably. But in literature, it's a long, long list of broken social norms. looking back, it is very funny. But what isn't funny is that this word is still being used, or this construct is still being used 120 years later. Here's some guys who had exhibiting the symptom waxy flexibility, who do look a bit bonkers, especially when you know they've been stood there for 2 hours. But when you read the text, you find out they have been told to stand there to see if they have another symptom called automatic obedience. And if the person who lets you out of hospital is the psychiatrist, and your chances of getting out of hospital at that point in history lifetime are 50-50, you damn well do what the psychiatrist tells you to do, however crazy it makes you. Anyway, since then we've done lots of amazing things to help people come out of their psychosis, like hanging them up from the ceiling. I don't know what that was about. This is the calming box. Wouldn't calm me down particularly, but this is the rotating chair which spins you back into insanity. Here's another thing we used to do. Oh dear, no. This is another thing. In 10 years' time, somebody will be stood here saying this is something we used to do. 2,000 people a year still have their brains electrocuted with 150 volts to cause grand mal seizures. So you have one branch of medicine trying to cure grand mal seizures or seizure disorders, and another branch of medicine causing it. We have, on September 19th, Lucy's mentioned it earlier, the Maudsley debate, September 19th, at the Institute of Psychiatry here in London, Denmark Hill, where I will be proposing the motion ECT has no place in modern medicine, which will be seconded by Sue Cunliffe, who was a GP until she had ECT. And so I will bore them to death with the research and pointing out that after 80 years it's probably a time. We had one study that shows it's more effective than placebo. And Sue will talk about what's happening to that person. So please, September 19th, have a look at the King's College London website and come along if you either had ECT, know somebody who's had ECT, or are just interested. It'd be good to have you. So in terms of what I'm supposed to be talking about, the actual causes of madness or psychosis, there is, of course, no single cause. All of those, usually in combination, increase your chances of mental health problems in general, but including this thing that's supposed to be the most biogenetically based of all, this psychosis thing, this schizophrenia thing. I'm not going to talk about all of them, don't worry, but I am going to just start with what the public thinks, because sometimes when you propose a psychosocial model, you can be told you're extremist and radical and an ideologue, and don't you understand that everybody knows this is a biological process? Well, no, everybody doesn't know that. In all of these countries, when you ask the public, what do you think causes, you can finish that sentence how you like, schizophrenia, psychosis, hearing voices, anything. In all of those countries, people say bad things happening. Poverty, loneliness, isolation, child abuse, violence, war, and so forth. There's only one country that gets it wrong. No offense, Laura, it's just a country that gets everything wrong, except for Laura. They can't help themselves, but we'll move on from that. Anybody who's American, I'll buy you a drink later. But interestingly, in every other country, the public has a psychosocial model. And then when you look at studies about people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia and ask them what they think the causes are, it's an even more psychosocial model than the average punter. So here's a study where 297 of 306 typical schizophrenics, that's their language, not mine, did not believe they had an illness and believed that there were bad things that had happened in their lives that had caused their difficulties. This, of course, was immediately dismissed as, quote, lack of insight, which is itself a symptom of the illness that they say they haven't got, but the psychiatrist says they have got. There is a word for it, has been recorded, never mind, this is what's called a mindfuck. There is no way out of that, and it is funny, but when you think of the distress that one of these people is probably in, and the powerlessness of it, that's an evil thing to do to somebody. To disagree is one thing, and to say why you disagree, and why you think it might be more helpful to take a biological view, that's one thing. But to say you're disagreeing with me is proof that I am right, is not acceptable. It gets a bit funny now because they have actually labelled this the particular phenomenon of disagreeing with your psychiatrist as anosognosia, and they have found the part of the brain that causes you to disagree with your psychiatrist. This is one of those classic do we laugh or cry moments. Let's laugh because it's just, I mean, it's just It's just too bizarre. So I usually frame these talks, which I'm fortunate enough to give all over the world these days, in this non-pejorative, non-divisive, bring everybody together sort of a way. Who is right? Millions of people all over the world, including service users, etc., or biological psychiatrists and drug company executives. We'll run through some of the possible causes. The genetic predisposition one, all of you will have read at some point, whether you're psychologists, social workers, nurses, or just people using the service, looking things up on Google, that there's a strong genetic predisposition for something called schizophrenia or psychosis. There is not. There is actually no genetic predisposition to any single page of the DSM. And this is the American Journal of Psychiatry back in 2008, reviewing all the studies that claim to have found a genetic predisposition, and saying that there is nothing outside of what would be expected by chance. They have stopped looking for the schizophrenia gene about 10 years ago. Now they're looking for hundreds and hundreds of tiny little gene combinations of genes which might somehow contribute to our understanding of why people hear voices. At a recent conference, I asked them, the geneticists, when you get to the end of this, what percentage of the variants do you think you would have explained and how long will it take? And they said about 20 years, and we probably would have explained about 11% of the variants. I said, at that point, can we have the fucking money back so that we can spend it on something useful? And could you please identify a single person in any mental health service anywhere in the world that has ever benefited from genetic research? Tends to cause a kind of silence. So the real causes, and poverty is the best predictor of just about everything, we probably know that, not just in the field of mental health, but certainly within this supposedly biogenetically caused phenomenon of psychosis or schizophrenia, people perhaps don't know that it's actually more predicted by poverty than depression and anxiety, and we've known that for 30 years. Relative poverty is even more predictive. I don't know if that's, oh, it is visible, good. So you've got income inequality, which is the difference between the income of the top 10% versus the bottom 10% in any culture, and the proportion of people with serious mental illness, use the language again. Good old USA out there in the lead in terms of the strength of that relationship. UK, this is a bit out of date, so we're nearly caught up now thanks to the tourist benefit cuts, we're second in the race. Italy, never include Italy in your research. On a more serious note, poverty is a powerful predictor, but also ethnicity is a very powerful predictor of this supposedly biological, genetically based thing. That's interesting, isn't it? How could that be if it's... but we now know, thanks to some very good research, why that is. Unsurprisingly, the reason that there are high rates of indigenous peoples or immigrants or ethnic minorities are to do with predictable things like poverty and unemployment, isolation from one's own culture, and degree of discrimination experience. And the area that I'm most associated with and I've done most of my research on is the relationship between child abuse and psychosis, which when we started 20 years ago was considered extraordinarily controversial. A little bit less so nowadays, but if you just look at the overall figures of studies in inpatient units, you see that the majority of both men and women have been either sexually or physically abused. It doesn't prove causation, it does suggest maybe we should be paying attention. Then you look at other types of childhood maltreatment. Lucy touched on this this morning, and other people have also. If you add all that up together, you're getting into the 80%, 90% range of people with a diagnosis of psychosis. And then there are things that are inevitable. I mean, abuse is preventable. Some things aren't. People die. Parents split up. But that's quite a strong finding. People with a diagnosis of psychosis using first episode psychosis services 12 times more likely to have had mum die in the first 6 or 7 years of life. Doesn't mean that's the cause by itself. It might mean perhaps we should ask people about these sorts of things to see if they might want to talk about it. They might not. Getting a bit technical now, in 2012 we had enough studies in this field that we put together the first meta-analysis, which looks like this, which is totally overwhelming. So it also looks like this, when we were looking at the most rigorous 41 studies. People who had suffered childhood adversity, and I I think it was Lucy said earlier, I can't remember, several people might have touched on it, adversity is probably a more useful term than trauma, because trauma is quite a narrow sort of thing we do need to be talking about, and neglect and those sorts of things as well, so we prefer adversity. Nearly 3 times more likely after you've controlled for everything else, which from a research point of view, just because someone was abused at age 8 and something happened at age 21, there's an awful lot of other things happening in between that you do your best to control for, including poverty and so forth. 9 of the 10 studies that tested for a dose response found it. Quick methodology lesson. If you're looking for a causal relationship between A and B, it's not sufficient to show that A and B co-occur. If you can show that more of A happens, the more likely B is. Then you're one step closer to being able to claim a causal relationship. So 9 of the 10 studies that looked for that found it. So there's another way to summarise it. It's good to see bullying in there, in terms of good in as much as we now find it on the research agenda. Sorry. Who's editing this? You know what I mean. We have been slow to bullying as a cause. Even Professor Robin Murray, who has been in Britain the most outspoken, most prominent psychiatrist in the area of psychosis and schizophrenia, following the usual biological mantras that this is a genetic predisposition, biochemical imbalance. And just last year, 2 years ago now, said in the last 2 decades it has become obvious that child abuse, urbanization, migration and adverse life events contribute to the etiology of schizophrenia and other psychoses. This has been a big shift for me. My preconceptions had made me blind to the influence of the social environment. Now, I was given a similar talk in Liverpool, the conference that Joe referred to, and I went on to say after this, what a shame Robin waited till the week after he retired to make this statement, because they can't get him now. And where's the apology for the damage that his getting it wrong for the previous 40 years has done? Not knowing that Robin was in the back row. It was an interesting lunch. After that, Robin asked me, why don't I just write a book about all the mistakes he's made in his life? To which I said it would take too long. So we're good mates, Robin and I. But I mean, on a more serious note, it is actually an honourable, certainly better than not doing it for someone that prominent, to speak to the next generation of psychiatrists and say we got it wrong. So I shouldn't minimise the importance of it. Moving on from the fact that there is a relationship between adversity and psychosis, many people are now trying to understand how that works, what useful psychological models are there that can help us piece together how it works, which can be useful theoretically, but more important, clinically. How do you get from that happening at age 8 to hearing voices or being paranoid? Sometimes you don't need a theory. We don't need a theory to say if people have been done in enough times in their life, they're going to be scanning for the next piece of shit that happens to them. That's paranoia. Yeah? We don't need a theory to explain why people scan. It would be odd if they weren't scanning. But sometimes it can help to have a bit of a theory to try and piece it all together. I will talk about the traumagenic neurodevelopmental one because it's important to find a way to include the brain in all this. We sometimes get accused of ignoring the brain when you say it's all psychosocial. So in 2001, we put out a paper that tried to address that issue. Because in every conference I've ever been to, you run into this slide. You know, you all have your favourite horror movie and you get to the scene where you just have to hide behind the setting because you can't bear what's coming up. Well, this is the slide at every schizophrenia conference. I have to get down and cover my eyes up, sit on my hands so I don't put my hand up, because far too often I have put my hand up and said, excuse me, what do you think a brain is for? And you get this silence in the room, and oh God, you've got a weirdo in here. And I said, well, let me help you out a bit more. What good would a brain be that did not respond to the environment? And a few people, oh. And the other half go, what? What's he doing? In every other field except psychiatry, when you put up slides like this, the first question is what happened to the people with a brain that is not doing so well? In psychiatry, there's evidence that this is a biological illness which is irrelevant to social events. So we got a bit sick of this and decided to put out this paper, because by the end of the century, the last century, the 1990s, was the first time we actually found out, not me personally, but researchers, mostly in America, neurologists, found out what was going on in the brains of traumatized children. So we had the opportunity for the first time to look at whether or not there was any similarity at all between the supposed brain differences between people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and there they are, you'll read this in any textbook, I won't go into the details of them. Any similarity between these differences that goes to show that schizophrenia is a brain disease and what goes on in the brains of traumatized children. And this is what we found. I'll do that again. Do you see what? Yeah. So people are now beginning to take a little more seriously the idea that just because you can show differences between brains of two groups of people, it does not mean it's a purely biological phenomenon. But then only biological psychiatry can oppose such a ridiculous thing in the first place. The consequences of all this are manifold. I'll touch on just 2 or 3 of them. One is that the medication that we use for people with this diagnosis does obviously not address the actual causes. It can't. A chemical cannot address the social, emotional, and personal causes of bad things having happened to you. Moreover, they don't even do what they claim to do. So rather than read through all this is a Cochrane review of a leading antipsychotic, so-called. It's barely better than placebo. And at the bottom, the concluding remarks of the Cochrane review were people with schizophrenia or their advocates may want to lobby regulatory authorities to insist on better studies being available before wide release of a compound with a subsequent beguiling advertising. This is the Cochrane review. This is not John Reed or Lucy Johnston or whatever. This is the Cochrane review. I'm going to change tack slightly and talk about antidepressants because it's very current at the moment. You may remember, if you're at all awake, in Britain, in January, in the front page of most of our leading newspapers, including our sensible newspapers, we found out that antidepressants actually do work, because someone had put out a meta-analysis and it got huge media coverage. It was a bizarre review. It only covered studies up for 8 weeks. It excluded all studies that had included people who were treatment resistant, so they only did studies of people that they knew it already worked on. The list is endless. The point is, a few people had the temerity to write to the press and point out this is a nonsense review, and didn't even mention side effects, including the withdrawal effects. The Royal College of Psychiatrists, 2 top experts, the 2 most powerful people, wrote to the Times saying this is nonsense to talk about withdrawal effects. Somebody had the temerity to talk about withdrawal effects. We know that the withdrawal effects of antidepressants hardly ever last longer than 2 weeks. This is a sort of misinformation that brings psychiatry into disrepute, and brings all of us into disrepute by association. So 30 of us wrote a formal complaint to the Royal College saying please retract that statement or provide some research evidence. They have done neither. 7 months later, what they did do is take down within 24 hours from their own website a survey of 800 antidepressant users showing that the withdrawal effects last far longer than 2 weeks in great numbers. And when we wrote formally to complain about that, they said, oh, it was out of date. We wrote back again and said 50 others are out of date. That was the only one that was taken down. Nobody believes you. You are bringing the profession of psychiatry into disrepute. Stop it. And we got nowhere. We recently wrote to the Minister of Health saying the opinion of these 30 experts, including 10 people who had been on antidepressants and had withdrawal effects for at least a year, and 8 professors, and on and on, we've written to the Minister of Health saying clearly the Royal College of Psychiatry is currently operating, quote unquote, beyond the normal bounds of science and beyond the normal bounds of ethical professional practice. It's a part of the obstacles that we've just been discussing in Laura's workshop, that we currently have a profession that is actually out of control and is not responding, even to letters signed by fellows of its own organisation. Yes, it makes me cross, and it makes me very sad as well. We used to have, not so long ago, psychiatrists, head of these organizations, who would say things like this. This is the head of the American Psychiatric Association, very brave. If we are seen as mere pill pushers and employees of the pharmaceutical industry, our credibility as a profession is compromised. As we address these big pharma issues, we must examine the fact that as a profession, we have allowed the biopsychosocial model to become the bio model. How I wish I'd thought that. And then here in England, his counterpart said it a little more succinctly: I cannot be the only person to be sickened by the sight of parties of psychiatrists standing at the airport desk with so many gifts with them they might as well have the name of the drug company tattooed across their foreheads. That's what a responsible leader of a profession says when their profession starts selling its soul to the drug companies. Unfortunately, we've gone backwards since then. I'm going to wind up with another rather important implication of the overuse of diagnosis in the medical model, is that it masks the sorts of things that we've been talking about today. It masks child abuse and neglect. And God knows it's hard enough, isn't it, to get these things public? But this is an active, I would say, almost intentional. It doesn't matter whether it's intentional, but the function is the same. We just published last year a review of, and there's only 21 studies looking at how often are people in mental health services even asked about abuse and neglect. Before we get on to whether they're provided with trauma-informed services, are they ever asked? 0 to 22% are asked. And we took a liberty of stating, at a point in history when child abuse is widely acknowledged internationally to be prevalent and damaging, and when church, educational, sporting and governmental organisations are being investigated for institutional collusion, one wonders whether collusion is too strong a word to apply to psychiatric services too. This review makes it clear that historical abuse and neglect are being systematically ignored, even by services which are specifically intended to provide support and healing for people in emotional distress. And my very last slide is to give people inside the services the last word. When I was in New Zealand and we decided to set up, to introduce a very simple abuse policy in the inpatient unit where I was working, which was a very sophisticated policy like, let's ask people. It was really, that's suffice. We were challenged at the last one, this is going to upset the patients. So we did a quick survey, it was a fairly quick survey, but nearly 100 people. We'll ask them, what do you think? The research question was simple. Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea to ask everybody as they enter mental health services whether they're abused or neglected as a child? And they were furious. They were furious at the person asking the question. She would get things like, I've been in mental health services for 30 years now, you fucking come along from the university and ask me about child abuse. Nobody's ever asked me that. What's the point of you? Then they would calm down a bit and realise this person was kind of on their side and wanted to hear their story, and they would come up with quotes like this, which we've used all over the world ever since in our training about how to ask about abuse. And I'll end with this. There was an assumption that I had a mental illness, and because I wasn't saying anything about my abuse, nobody knew. There were so many doctors and nurses and social workers, and I'm sure psychologists, in your life, asking you about the same thing, mental, but not asking you why. I just wish they would have said, what happened to you? What happened? But they didn't. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jim.